Listen, it was July 3rd, 1988. The clock hit 10:24 in the morning. Everything seemed normal for an Airbus A300 B2-203. This was an aircraft manufactured in 1982, carrying registration number EPIBU. It had been flying for 11,497 hours. On that day, there were 290 people on board. That includes the passengers and the crew, 290 souls. They were just in the middle of their flight, going about their day, heading toward their destination. But then, it just ended. 4 kilometers southeast of Qeshm Island, Iran. There were no survivors, none. 290 people gone. Can you believe that? Nobody saw it coming. How does a routine flight turn into a complete nightmare in a split second? What were the people in those seats thinking when the world suddenly went dark? Can you believe that 290 lives were lost without a single person walking away? How do we even begin to make sense of a tragedy like this? I am Captain James Harlow. I spent 28 years in the cockpit, and I have seen how quickly things can change in the sky. Welcome aboard. Here's the thing. We are going to look at what really happened on that flight. Let me be clear. This is not just about the numbers or the plane itself. It is about the people who were on that Airbus. We are going to dig into the facts and see exactly what went wrong on that Sunday morning. You have to understand, the truth is often much simpler and much sadder than people realize. Let us walk through it together. Let me tell you who these people were and what they were flying. We are talking about an Airbus A300 B2-203. It was a wide-body twin-engine jet, a workhorse of its time. This specific machine left the factory back in 1982. That makes it a 6-year-old aircraft at the time of the event. It had racked up 11,497 hours in the air. That is a lot of time spent cruising at 35,000 feet. You have to understand, these planes were designed to be tough. They were built to connect cities and bring people together across oceans and borders. Listen, the operator, Iran Air, was using this specific aircraft for a scheduled passenger service. It was meant to be a simple hop from Bandar Abbas Airport over to Dubai Airport. A quick trip, a routine connection. Pay attention to these numbers because they tell a story of their own. There were 290 people on that plane. 290 souls who expected to land in Dubai for business, for family, or just to get back home. When you look at the manifest, you see parents, children, and workers. Just ordinary people living their lives. Here is the thing. The official records regarding the specific identities and the personal backgrounds of the flight crew do not actually list their names. Let me be clear, we do not have their biographies. We do not have their flight hour counts or their personal histories in the investigative file. That is a strange reality of this specific case. We know the plane, we know the weight of the loss, but the individuals in the cockpit remain ghosts in the record. Here is what nobody talks about regarding the operational environment. You have a massive commercial jet, a passenger plane, moving along an established route. The A300 B2-203 was an advanced machine for that era, relying on complex systems and a dedicated crew to manage the flight path. It was not meant to be a target, it was meant to be a transit vehicle in the sky. These pilots were trained to handle emergencies, weather shifts, and mechanical issues. They were trained to fly from point A to point B safely. But in this case, their training could not have prepared them for what was waiting for them in the air that morning. You can be the best pilot in the world, with thousands of hours under your belt, but you cannot fly your way out of an unexpected external threat that you cannot even see coming. The context of the period was incredibly tense. The region was a pressure cooker, and civil aviation was caught right in the middle of it. When you look at the flight path, it was a corridor that thousands of people had flown through without incident. It was a standard commercial path. You have to understand that as a pilot, you rely on the assumption that the sky is organized. You follow your flight plan, you talk to air traffic control, and you trust that the people on the ground know who you are. This was not a test flight in the middle of nowhere. It was a public, scheduled commercial airline flight. Can you believe that? A plane full of innocent people, operating exactly as they were supposed to, suddenly finding themselves in a situation that was completely outside of their control. The technical details of the Airbus, the maintenance logs,
and the hours on the airframe are just data points. But the human element, the fact that 290 people were just sitting there in their seats, waiting to reach Dubai, that is the part that keeps me up at night. It just does not make sense. It never will. Listen, you have to understand that the atmosphere inside the terminal at Bandar Abbas that morning was the definition of mundane. People were checking bags, grabbing a quick cup of coffee, and finding their seats. They were focused on the simple logistics of travel, just trying to get to their destination on time. The atmosphere outside was clear. The sky was that bright, unforgiving blue you only see in that part of the world. There were no clouds to hide behind, no storms to navigate, and no mechanical quirks reported by the ground crew that would have given anyone a reason to pause. The Airbus was sitting on the tarmac, a massive machine resting quietly, waiting for the 290 souls to board. It was a standard, professional, and entirely unremarkable start to a day that would become anything but. Here is the thing. When you are in the cockpit of a commercial jet like the A300, you spend a lot of time following strict procedures. You climb to your assigned altitude, you stay on your assigned path, and you listen to the radio. That is exactly what this flight was doing. They were cruising along a path that had been carved out in the sky for years. You have to imagine the cabin noise, that steady, low hum of the engines, the sound of the air conditioning, and the murmur of passengers talking to each other. Maybe someone was reading a book. Maybe a child was looking out the window at the shimmering water of the Persian Gulf below. It was peaceful. It was exactly what you expect when you pay for a ticket and trust the airline to get you home. And then, the transition happened. It was not a mechanical failure. It was not a pilot error. It was an external interruption that shattered the entire environment. You see, when you are flying, you expect the sky to be a shared space, a place where professional rules and clear identification govern how everyone interacts. But that morning, the rules of the road simply vanished. The pilots were flying, they were communicating, and they were doing their jobs perfectly. They had no reason to believe that their flight path would be perceived as anything other than what it was, a civilian airliner on a scheduled route. Let me be clear, there was no warning alarm in the cockpit that would have told them they were being treated as a threat. They were just flying. Think about the silence in the cockpit for a moment. You are cruising, everything is green on your monitors, and you are thinking about the landing in Dubai. You are checking your fuel, your arrival time, and your radio frequencies. You are entirely focused on the future, landing the plane, getting to the gate, and finishing the shift. You are not thinking about the possibility that someone might be watching you through a radar screen with an entirely different perspective. That is the tragedy of this moment. The disconnect between what the pilots knew and what was happening on the ground was absolute. They were in their own world, trusting the systems and expecting the day to proceed, just like thousands of other flights. Then comes the moment of realization. It is a terrifying thought, but imagine the shift in the cockpit when the environment stops being a routine flight and starts feeling like a nightmare. You have those seconds where you look at your instruments and realize that the world has changed around you. Maybe there was a sudden shift in the radio traffic or a change in the way the air traffic control was responding to them. The plane was carrying 290 people, and at 10:24, the reality of their situation collided with the external threat. It happened in an instant. There was no time to explain to the passengers. There was no time to make an announcement. The pilots were suddenly fighting to keep a plane flying that had been struck by a force they did not fully understand. Look, you have to consider the scale of this. The Airbus is a huge piece of engineering. When it takes a hit, the structure itself begins to fail. The control surfaces, those movable parts on the wings and tail that let the pilot steer, they rely on hydraulic pressure, which is like the blood of the airplane. If that pressure is cut or the systems are damaged, the plane stops responding to the pilots. It becomes a heavy, metal weight falling through the sky. I have been in the air for thousands of hours, and I can tell you that the most helpless feeling a pilot can have is holding the yoke and feeling absolutely nothing from the airplane. It is like trying to drive a car where the steering wheel has disconnected from the tires. The final sequence was incredibly brief. You have a massive aircraft designed for steady, high-altitude travel, suddenly losing its integrity.
The pressure in the cabin would have been lost instantly. The alarms, they call it a master warning system, would have been screaming, flashing red lights everywhere, telling the crew that the engines, the navigation, and the electrical systems were failing all at once. It is a sensory overload. The pilots were likely trying to compensate for the sudden loss of lift, pulling back on the controls, trying to stabilize a ship that had already been mortally wounded. They were fighting for those 290 people until the very last millisecond. Imagine the perspective of the passengers. They were just sitting there, maybe checking their watches, expecting to be in Dubai soon. Then, the world tilted. The plane would have shuddered under the force of the hit. The sound of the wind rushing into the fuselage would have been deafening. It is a chaotic, violent, and terrifying transition from a smooth, comfortable flight to a total loss of control. There is no training for that. There is no simulation that prepares you for the moment the plane itself begins to break apart in the air. The final seconds were not about flying anymore. They were about the sheer weight of the airplane gravity pulling it down toward the water. The impact itself, 4 kilometers southeast of Qeshm Island, was the end of the line. The water in the Gulf is not soft when you hit it at that speed. It is like hitting solid concrete. When that Airbus touched down on the surface, it did not float. It disintegrated. Everything, the seats, the overhead bins, the fuselage, was shattered by the energy of the impact. The silence that followed must have been haunting. One moment, there was a scheduled flight full of people, and in the next, there was nothing but debris and the flat, indifferent surface of the sea. It is a hard thing to process. 290 people, just gone. Can you believe that? No one had a chance to react. No one had a chance to say goodbye. The investigation by the ICAO later tried to piece together the fragments, but the reality is that the story ended right there, in the water, in the middle of a morning that should have been just another Sunday. Every time I think about it, I go back to that moment of the impact. I think about the pilots, their hands still on the controls, desperately trying to keep the plane in the air. I think about the passengers, whose only mistake was being on a flight that was caught in a crossfire they could never have anticipated. It is a stark reminder of how fragile our world is, even when we are thousands of feet above it. There were no survivors to tell us what they saw in those last moments. We only have the data, the reports, and the silence that remains. It is the kind of story that never really leaves you once you understand what was lost. The air inside the fuselage suddenly screams as the pressure differential tears through the metal skin. You have to understand, at that speed, the air acts like a solid wall. The pilots feel the yoke fight back, vibrating with a violent intensity that tells them the flight surfaces are no longer responding to their commands. They are pushing, pulling, and trying to level the wings, but the airplane is already falling. It is a terrifying, sickening descent. The passengers feel the drop in their stomachs, that heavy sensation of weightlessness, followed by a crushing force as the aircraft begins to break apart in the sky. The sound is not just an explosion, but a series of sharp, metallic snaps, like the spine of a giant machine being broken. The cabin lights flicker and then die, leaving the rows of seats in a dim, dusty haze. Everything not bolted down becomes a projectile. People are being tossed about, the cabin air filling with debris and the smell of ozone. It is a blur of motion, of gravity taking hold, and of a frantic, desperate struggle to comprehend the impossible. There is no time to fix anything. The damage to the systems is total. The pilots are fighting against physics, trying to keep the nose up, but the airplane has no energy left to hold a glide. It is a brick. There is no hope of recovery because the vital flight control surfaces are gone, and the engines are failing to produce any meaningful thrust. They are not flying anymore. They are just falling toward the water. It is a matter of seconds. The flight deck is filled with the sound of the master warning alarms, a rhythmic, piercing tone that signals the end of all control. There is no heroism in the sense of landing the plane, because the plane no longer has the ability to land. There is only the brutal reality of the descent. The pilots stay at their stations, gripping the controls until the final, bone-jarring impact with the surface of the sea. The moment the aircraft hits the water, the chaos stops. It is replaced by a sudden, heavy stillness. The ocean does not yield,
and the plane is shredded into thousands of pieces upon contact. The surface of the water, which was calm only moments before, is suddenly churned with fuel, debris, and the remnants of what was a passenger cabin. Within minutes, the currents start to scatter the wreckage across the area. There is no rescue mission in the traditional sense, because there is nothing left to save. The surface of the Persian Gulf looks deceptively peaceful as the ripples fade away. On land, the families waiting at the arrival gate in Dubai begin to check the screens. They look for the flight number, hoping for a delay, hoping for any information at all. The silence from the airport staff is the first sign that something is terribly wrong. News begins to filter out, slow and painful. The international community starts to ask questions, but the answers are buried deep under the water. The ICAO begins the process of gathering the data, attempting to piece together the sequence of events from the radar logs and the fragmented evidence found in the water. It is a somber, grim task. You know, people were expecting their loved ones to walk through those sliding glass doors, and instead, they were left waiting in a terminal that suddenly felt like a tomb. The investigation begins, but it cannot bring back the lives that were lost on that Sunday morning. It is a cold, hard reality. Here is the thing. The world had to grapple with the fact that 290 people were gone, and the reasons why would haunt the records for decades to come. No one was coming home. The ocean held all the answers, and the silence that remained was the loudest part of the whole tragedy. Can you believe that? A whole flight, just erased from the sky. First, we have to talk about the radar identification error. Here is the thing. You have a sophisticated warship sitting in that part of the world with radar screens that are supposed to tell the difference between a friend and a foe. The system was designed to track military aircraft, but on that morning, it misinterpreted the signals coming from the Airbus. You know? It is like looking at a silhouette in the dark and assuming it is a threat because your brain is already primed to see one. The crew on that ship believed they were looking at a completely different type of aircraft, a tactical fighter, rather than a slow, climbing commercial jet. It is a massive, inexcusable error in judgment that happened in the span of a few heartbeats. They saw a blip on a screen, and because of the high tension in the region, they skipped the most important step of all, verifying exactly what they were looking at before taking action. It is hard to wrap your head around that. A machine worth millions of dollars, and a crew trained to be the best, all failing at the most basic level of target identification. Second, the breakdown in communication and the failure of the identification procedures were critical. You have to understand, these commercial flights follow specific lanes. They are like highways in the sky. If you are operating a military vessel in these waters, you have to know where those highways are, and you have to be watching for the planes that stay on them. The pilots of the Airbus were doing everything right. They were squawking the correct code on their transponder, which is like a digital handshake that tells ground radar exactly who they are. But the ship's system either missed that signal, or the people watching the screen ignored what it was telling them. Can you believe that? A digital system designed to prevent these exact tragedies simply failed to bridge the gap between the ship and the airliner. It highlights a terrifying reality of modern conflict. Technology is only as good as the human being making the final call. When the link between the plane and the ship broke, it wasn't a technical glitch in the wires. It was a disconnect in the human chain of command. Nobody double-checked the data. Nobody asked the simple question, could this be a civilian plane? That missing question cost 290 people their lives. Third, we have to address the sheer pressure of the operational environment. Let me be clear, when you are in a war zone, your stress levels are through the roof. You are looking for any sign of trouble, and sometimes you end up finding it even when it is not there. This is what we call target fixation. It is a psychological trap where you become so convinced that you are in danger that you stop seeing the evidence that proves you are not. The crew on the ship was already in a state of high alert, and when they saw that radar return, they didn't see a passenger jet carrying families. They saw a target. It is a classic human failure. When you are scared or pressured, your perspective narrows. You stop thinking logically and start reacting impulsively. This wasn't a calculated choice. It was a snap decision made in a vacuum of bad information and high anxiety.
You have to understand that in aviation, we are taught that the most dangerous thing you can do is let your emotions drive the plane. When you lose that professional distance, you are not just a danger to yourself, you are a danger to everyone around you. In this case, that loss of perspective reached out and destroyed a flight that had absolutely nothing to do with the conflict. It is heartbreaking to think that such a massive tragedy was triggered by a momentary lapse in calm. They had the tools to know the truth, but they were blinded by the noise of their own situation. It is the most preventable kind of mistake, and yet, it is the one we seem to make over and over again in the history of the world. 290 people lost their lives because someone on a ship couldn't step back, breathe, and look at the screen for just a few seconds longer. That is the tragedy of it all. You can have all the radars, all the sensors, and all the firepower in the world, but if you don't have the clarity to use them right, none of it matters. The sky is big, but it is not big enough to hide from a mistake that big. Everyone on that Airbus was at the mercy of a decision made by people they would never meet, in a context they would never understand. And that, more than anything else, is why this story is so difficult to tell. It reminds us that we are all just passengers on a journey, and sometimes, the road ends not because of anything we did, but because of a choice made thousands of feet below us. Listen, the fallout from this disaster forced the world to wake up to a hard truth about how we manage the sky during times of conflict. After the investigation by the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, the aviation industry had to overhaul how commercial flights and military forces share the same airspace. You have to understand, before this, the systems were like two ships passing in the night that refused to acknowledge each other. One of the biggest changes was the refinement of the Identification Friend or Foe system, commonly known as IFF. Following the events of 1988, there was a massive push to integrate these military systems with civilian secondary surveillance radar. This way, any military commander looking at a screen would see an automated, unambiguous tag identifying a blip as a civilian airliner, not just a generic target. It effectively removed the guesswork that led to the death of everyone on that Airbus. We also saw a fundamental change in communication protocols between military command centers and regional air traffic control offices. Now, there are direct, permanent, and prioritized communication links that ensure civilian flight paths are clearly marked and respected, even when tensions are running high. It is all about creating a failsafe where the human error of misidentification is backed up by a system that simply will not let you make the wrong call. These changes were not just suggestions. They became the global standard for how we operate in crowded, contested air corridors. The lesson was clear. You cannot just assume a plane is a threat because your radar says so. You have to talk, you have to verify, and you have to have a second set of eyes on the data. It is a grim reality that it took the loss of 290 innocent lives for the world to finally implement these safeguards. It makes you wonder why it took so long, but at least now, we have these protocols in place to stop another tragedy like this from ever happening again. The ICAO report serves as a permanent, painful reminder that the sky is not a battlefield, and it should never be treated like one. It keeps me up sometimes, thinking about those 290 people. They were just families, coworkers, and friends, all going about their normal lives until the very last second. You see a list of names or a number on a chart, but you have to remember that behind every single one of those lives was a person with a story, a family waiting for them to walk through the door, and a future that was stolen in an instant. It is a heavy thing to carry, and, as a pilot, it hits me right in the chest. We trust the system, we trust the people on the ground, and we trust that our common humanity will prevail, even in the worst of times. But that day, that trust was broken in the worst way possible. I am a retired captain, and I run this channel on my own, with just a handful of people who believe in telling these stories the right way. If you found any value in what we talked about today, I would really appreciate your support. If you can, consider hitting that subscribe button or joining as a member. It helps keep the channel independent, so I can keep digging into these records without anyone telling me what I can or cannot say. And look, clicking the like button takes you all of 2 seconds, but it tells the algorithm that this story matters, and it helps get the truth out to more people who need to hear it. I really want to know what you think about this.
Do you think we have done enough to protect civilian planes from military error? Or are we still just as vulnerable today as we were back in 1988? Leave a comment down below and let us have a real conversation about it. Thanks for listening, and I will see you in the next one.